Hello, welcome to Frontiers here on Sparks 1524. I'm Nathaniel Miller. Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, really was born in a log cabin. And one of those odd stories in which history really is a little more profound than fiction often is. He was born to a frontier family on what at the time was the wild, untamed American West. And of course, we know the general story. He rises from that to become a lawyer, a state delegate. He's in the House of Representatives for a little while and eventually president and leads us through the Civil War. Lincoln has been my favorite president most of my life, followed very closely by General Washington. I've been to where President Lincoln died numerous times over at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., but I never had a chance to visit where he grew up, or much less where he was born. When I retired from the Navy in September of 2017, I embarked on a year-long Grand Tour USA. Starting in November of 2017 to November of 2018, I was on the road, pretty much living out of my car, seeing all 50 states. Before you ask, I flew to Alaska and I flew to Hawaii. My car, Sarah Jane, she's good, but she's not quite up to driving across the Pacific Ocean. I had started the Grand Tour in November, right after Thanksgiving, drove up to Ohio, saw my brother and his family. They were living there at the time. So I saw a little bit on the way there, but the first big launch into the unknown was when I left their house, because on the way up there, I stopped at a few places I'd already been. So leaving their house, I zipped into the unknown, and I started that unknown by going to Hodgenville, Kentucky, which is where President Lincoln was born. Now, I'd like to digress for just a minute. I actually joined YouTube back in 2012. That was just as a viewer, and this whole Sparks 1524 channel was mainly a digital storage shed in which I would store training videos for the classes I taught on photography and writing and video production, etc. This evolution of the channel that you're watching now went live in 2021. I still laugh at myself about that because I went live with a video program only a couple of months before moving from Washington State back here to Florida. I taught video in the Navy for almost 7 years. I know how much work goes into video. My own fortes were still photography and writing, but I taught video. I edited it. I know exactly how much effort goes into making video productions, even small ones. So I started a video channel right when I'm about to move. That's me for you. Originally, this channel in this evolution was supposed to be a mirror image of my written blog, sparks1524.com. As I started traveling across the country, this all became much more of a travel blog, and by the time I was here in Florida, I was up in the air about exactly what I wanted to do with it. And it's taken a couple of years to get it to the format you see now. This has become a place where I can talk about my sea stories. I can talk about history, occasionally even give you my unfiltered opinion on the controversial topics of the day. Now, I guess you're wondering at this point what any of this has to do with Hodgenville, Kentucky. Well, you see, in what we call a hook in the video world, where I'm going to drop a little teaser that will hopefully pique your interest long enough to keep you in the video. This channel, the evolution of this channel that you're watching now, is the fault of Abraham Lincoln. Kentucky was a wild, untamed frontier in 1809. Interstate highways, the internet, electricity, and even whiskey were still far in a future never imagined by those struggling to survive in this dynamic wilderness. The Lincoln family, Thomas and Nancy Lincoln, and their young daughter, Sarah, settled on Sinking Spring Farm outside of Hodgenville. Despite Kentucky's tangled and decidedly Byzantine legal conflicts over land deeds, the Lincolns were confident they had a stable home near a spring which provided clean, clear running water. February 12, 1809 dawned cold with sharp biting air, but inside the small warm cabin, Nancy Lincoln was in labor. Before the day was out, the Lincolns welcomed their second child into the world, a little boy whom daughter Sarah would dote on as they grew up together. They named the boy Abraham. After I left my brother's place in early December, I rolled into Hodgenville, Kentucky on December 7th of 2017. I didn't really know what to expect, but what I found is not anything like what I imagined. I'm not talking about the road trip aspect. I grew up in the military. I've been traveling all my life. I know what a road trip takes. I'd always envisioned Lincoln's birthplace as out on the prairie somewhere with waving grass, like the old, you know, basically that Lincoln's home would look like the opening credits to the old series, Little House on the Prairie. What I wasn't expecting was to roll into a small town in a very hilly part of Kentucky and find that his birthplace was in the middle of the forest. Long before the area became a national park, the nation erected the first ever Lincoln Memorial at Sinking Springs. Building a suitably grand hall was the top priority, followed closely by trying to find the actual cabin Lincoln was born in. The Great Hall's cornerstone was laid on February 12, 1909 by President Theodore Roosevelt, and the building was dedicated in 1911 by President William Howard Taft. The Memorial Hall sits on the most likely site where Thomas Lincoln would have built the cabin that sheltered his family. When the Lincolns left the farm, the cabin was, well, ignored. This was 1811 after all, and the cabin was just another frontier cabin. Late in the 19th century, an old cabin reputedly built with logs from Lincoln's birthplace was acquired and shown around the nation. Following the Grand Hall's completion, this cabin was put on display inside and hailed for decades as the cabin President Lincoln was born in. Research in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, including advanced dendrochronology, finally proved the cabin on display is not the Lincoln birthplace. For starters, its wood is at least 10 years too young to have been harvested for a house in 1808. Secondly, the original cabin most likely was cannibalized for parts long before Lincoln built a name for himself. Today, the Park Service maintains this substitute cabin as a teaching aid. The structure is typical of early 19th century frontier cabins, providing visitors a truly unique look into the life of baby Lincoln. Once Thomas Lincoln had lost the dispute over the deed to the Sinking Spring farm, he bought another tract of land and moved his family about a mile or so away to Knob Creek Farm. Coincidentally enough, Knob Creek Farm lay right alongside Knob Creek. The family again thought they had a stable home, and more importantly, in the immediate moment, they once again had a source of fresh, clean running water pretty much right outside the door. And in a pre industrial society, having running water that close to you is an invaluable resource. And if you picked up on me saying they thought they had a stable home, that, ladies and gentlemen, is what's known as foreshadowing. Abraham Lincoln was 2 when the family was forced off Sinking Springs due to the infernal land disputes tearing Kentucky apart. Thomas Lincoln bought a new farm at Knob Creek, moving the family by just a few miles. Sadly, Knob Creek is the site of the first Lincoln family death, Sarah and Abraham's younger brother, Thomas Lincoln Jr. The infant was said to have lived no more than 3 days and was buried in nearby Redmond Cemetery, but his grave has been lost to time. However, the simple headstone Thomas Lincoln placed at the grave was found discarded in a field and is now on display at the National Park Visitor Center. Abraham himself nearly died at Knob Creek. According to the story, he was caught in the creek after it was swollen from rain, nearly drowning until the Lincoln's neighbor, Austin Gollihar, extended a branch for him to grab hold of, thereby saving the life of the future president. Once again, the Lincoln family found themselves in a land dispute. Somebody else had popped up with a deed, this time to the Knob Creek farm. Thomas Lincoln fought, but once again, just like with Sinking Spring, he lost the case. Fed up with the haphazard, free-for-all nature of Kentucky land ownership, he packed up the family and they headed north to Indiana. Indiana had good arable land, just like Kentucky, but Indiana had one distinct advantage. Indiana had been formally surveyed, so there would be no question about the deeds once he bought some property. Lincoln's story ends in Kentucky, but it picks up in Indiana as he goes through his boyhood into young manhood before going to Illinois. His time in Kentucky was relatively short when measured against the entire span of his life, but that time in Kentucky was formative because those first early years were the first memories he would carry with him about living on the prairie and learning the first lessons of becoming a self-made man. Once the Lincolns decamped for Indiana, Gollihar moved and repurposed their cabin as a stable, but it was destroyed by a flood years later. The cabin on site today actually belonged to Gollihar, but was moved to occupy the site where the Lincolns lived during their time at Knob Creek. Just like the ceremonial cabin at the Sinking Spring farm, the Gollihar cabin is typical of the home Lincoln would have lived in, but it has the added provenance of having actually belonged to a neighbor of the Lincoln family, so it has a direct connection to Abraham Lincoln's life. Today, Hodgenville is a small Midwestern town dedicated to preserving the memory of its most famous son. Hodgenville's town square is dominated by two statues of Lincoln, a young boyhood Lincoln looking across to the adult President Lincoln. The Lincoln Museum is a quirky institution that just might blow your socks off. Despite its humble appearance, the museum features incredibly lifelike wax figures of Abraham and Mary Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, and other notable figures from Lincoln's life. The facility can easily be toured in an afternoon, but it will wallop you with the fantastic amount of detail you'll discover about President Lincoln's life and times. A little bit ago in the introduction, I promised you a tieback that would explain the hook about how all of this is Abraham Lincoln's fault. I was upstairs in the Lincoln Museum and I had a brilliant idea. I set my little camera phone up and I decided, ooh, let me try seeing if I could do a 2 minutes of travel with Nathaniel Miller. So I filmed a few segments up there in the museum just to test it out and very quickly realized that was a bad idea at the moment. I didn't have the equipment to capture any kind of good audio. I didn't have any level of video software on my laptop that could work. Plus, I was also just moving around too much. So the whole idea of travel videos kind of went into the back of my mind, and I focused on my written blog and doing my travel logs there. So flash forward to February of 2021, I'm still in Washington State, and I decided to start this video channel because the idea of doing video programming had never left my head. I was just trying to figure out the right way to do it. And even when I started this channel, this evolution of the channel in February of 21, it took me the last couple of years to really get my head wrapped around what I want to focus on, how I want to focus on it, and then within those interests, what my audience is actually interested in hearing. Taken a couple of years to do that, but I got here. But all of this started because of an idea in the Lincoln Museum. Therefore, I make the claim that this entire channel is Abraham Lincoln's fault. And in journalism, ladies and gentlemen, that is what's known as a tieback. Obviously, this channel is not literally Abraham Lincoln's fault. I mean, about a century separates that man's lifetime from mine, but it's fun to say. Interestingly enough, though, the program idea I had there in the Lincoln Museum, 2 minutes of travel with Nathaniel Miller, is the one part of all the original conceptions for this channel as you're watching it that survived. On the waterfront and past explorations and travelogue have now morphed into Pierside for sea stories, legends, and maritime lore, Frontiers for chasing the horizon on land and in the air, unless they're involved with the Navy, and Short Takes. 2 minutes of travel was simply retitled Short Takes back in 2021 because Short Takes is a more pithy title. But that's the one concept that's gone through the whole thing. And that's the one concept I had there in the Lincoln Museum. Another little tie back to my time visiting Abraham Lincoln's birthplace. I appreciate your time on this journey, not just to President Lincoln's birthplace, but also through a little snippet of my life and how my life interwines a little bit with his story. That's one of the great things about traveling and learning about not just people you admire, but places you admire. The very act of visiting those places, the very act of visiting the birthplace of these people or sites significant to their lives, lets each of us become a little part of their story, as well as them becoming part of our story. By visiting Lincoln's birthplace, visiting the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, visiting the place where Lincoln died, lets me not just touch his life and learn more about him, it lets me personally become a little part of the Lincoln story, and the Lincoln story becomes a little part of my life story. That's the great thing about always chasing that horizon and finding out what's over there. You're expanding your own personal story by becoming part of the greater story that's around us. If you like this video, please do hit that like button. Feel free to share this anywhere you like. Finally, if you enjoyed the programming here on Sparks 1524, I'd ask you to hit that subscribe button so you can keep up with me as I produce new episodes. Until we meet here again on Sparks 1524, I hope you have a great week, and remember, chase that horizon and always go and do some great things.